Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Valentina Gabusi, and I am in charge of teacher training here at Zanichelli. And I welcome you to this webinar on behalf of Zanichelli, and I also welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Tim Parks. Hello, Tim.
Hello. Good evening to everybody. I'm honored to be here and wish I could see you, but obviously not.
So tonight we'll be discussing dystopia, which is a very fascinating genre, still very popular today, still very loved by teenagers. And we'll be discussing the origins of dystopia, its main masterpieces, and also some contemporary still masterpieces. So before doing that, I will tell you something about Tim Parks, our speaker, which is quite well famous, but let me tell you something about him. First of all, he is a deep connoisseur of literature. So he studied English literature in Britain, in Cambridge, and then he perfectioned American literature in the United States, in Harvard. Then in 1981, he moved to Italy, and ever since he has been many things. First of all, he's a writer, an essayist, a novelist, a journalist. One of his novels, Europa, was also a finalist at the prestigious Booker Prize, and in Italy he is published by Adelphi. He is also a translator. He has translated many Italian writers, from Machiavelli to Pavese to Tabucchi. And of course, he taught translation and translation studies at university for many, many years. So he knows his way about literature and text. And now, Tim, the stage is all yours.
Okay, here we are. I presume that I'm now center stage, which is very exciting. Okay, so we're going to be talking about dystopias. We'll start immediately. I'm going to share the screen. We'll follow a series of notes on a PowerPoint and hopefully say something interesting. So here we go. Get this thing going. Right. So let's quickly just set up what our agenda is going to be for the talk. We're going to talk generally about utopias and dystopias, since I feel that we can't really understand the dystopia unless we understand the utopia. We're going to look at one or two forerunners from past centuries, some of which we've already studied in earlier parts of our discussions of British literature. Then we're going to look at the two central visions of the 20th century, which are very much opposing visions, Brave New World and 1984. And then right at the end, we'll say a few words about dystopias as a contemporary genre. So first of all, a few general principles. Just because I think it's useful to get a sense of what this genre is. Let's say that any vision of utopia presumes the absence of a natural social order, and at the same time, the possibility of human organization and control. That is, it's only when we believe that humans can actually organize their society that it becomes possible to imagine utopias. We could argue that Plato's Republic offers the first elaborate description of an ideal way of organizing society, a description that indicates very clearly that man and not God is in control. But of course, the Republic doesn't present a society that's actually been achieved, but just ideas for achieving it. We should notice that because of these facts, these societies tend to challenge a religious vision of social order. That is a vision where we have a natural, divinely ordained social order. I think this is one of the reasons why we don't see utopias and dystopias in the long period of Christian domination through the Middle Ages, but we see instead ideas about a divinely achieved society and a society that is full of sin and corruption. Finally, we might say that dystopias are utopias that have gone wrong. That is, they are highly organized societies, but societies that create unhappiness rather than happiness. Let's look at a few forerunners then. Obviously, we have to mention Sir Thomas More's Utopia, written in 1516, but written in Latin in 1516. It was published in English in 1551. And utopia, of course, is a word he borrows from Greek, from the expression utopos, no place. So right from the start, it's clear that utopia is not an easily achievable thing. More's Utopia begins with a description of Christian Europe impoverished and divided by ruthless self-interest. And I mention this because it leads us to a general principle that I think every utopia and dystopia must be understood in relation to the society it's written in. Every dystopia, every utopia is a comment on the situation now. So when we look at any of these texts, we have to be aware of what the situation was when the text was written. So they're very much political documents. At the same time, More's Utopia actually parodies elements in Plato's Republic. It's very aware of Plato's Republic. So a kind of debate is established between these texts. And I think another point, so we have utopias are in relation to the society they're written in, but they're also in relation to each other. This is a very long debate, probably one of the longest in human history, always political. We will see that lots of the books we are mentioning are written in answer to other books. So just a word on the contents of Thomas More's book. A mysterious traveler describes a distant land where selfishness has been replaced by a kind of proto-communist organization. Property is held in common, education is state-controlled, and the book discusses religious pluralism, women's rights, divorce, euthanasia, and so on. Now, it's extraordinary that these themes discussed in 1516 by Thomas More, we will find in all utopias and dystopias. The contents, the actual problem of organizing human society remains fairly constant. I want to mention very briefly The Tempest, though it's hardly a classic utopia, but we could say that Prospero uses magic to impose a tiny but perfect society where evil is kept at bay by the application of supernatural powers. Now, the students have already looked at The Tempest, so I think it's useful to mention texts that they already know of so that they can begin to as it were, establish a position to put things in relation to each other. It's understood in The Tempest, as indeed in Thomas More's Utopia, that the perfect community can only exist in very special, isolated conditions. Utopias are always ahistorical. They're always outside history. I think this is an important point. The idea of a utopia or a dystopia is to arrive at an organization of society that is final and that cannot change. Outside in the real world, Shakespeare's real world outside the island of the Tempest, injustice and cruelty thrives and threatens to invade Prospero's paradise. But let's remember that the play offers the line that will be the title of Aldous Huxley's great dystopic novel, Brave New World. So let's just remember that when Prospero's daughter, Miranda, sees the handsome young men who are shipwrecked on the island, she cries out with delight, "Oh, brave new world that hath such people in it." And her father replies, "It's new to you," suggesting that he is not at all convinced about the wonders of the new world. The last text I want to mention that we've already looked at is Gulliver's Travels, 1726. We remember that Swift describes imaginary worlds in order to establish a satirical comparison with contemporary England. I don't want to go into detail about Lilliput or Brobdingnag, etc. I just want to mention in the flying island of Laputa. The flying island of Laputa is a society entirely organized by scientists, and hence it offers us the first vision of a technocracy, a society that's been taken over by the technical experts. However, all sense of practicality has been lost, and people are absorbed in theoretical questions at the expense of happiness and justice, which brings us to another key principle that we'll find in most dystopias: the reflection that human intervention often causes effects quite opposite to those planned, hence to dystopia rather than utopia. So let's have a quick summary. All these texts have evident political agendas. And I think one thing is, when we're talking about dystopias in the classroom, inevitable, one has to be ready for political discussion, because these texts are designed to provoke political discussion. They mix essay and fiction in a much more evident way than other fictions. I think it's a good idea reading these texts to challenge students to distinguish elements of essay and elements of fiction, and to ask if they go well together. I mean, I think in some of the books we're looking at, they go together better than in others. So that's an intriguing question, just from a writer's point of view, how to mix essay and fiction. The utopia or dystopia form can obviously be useful in a society where it's dangerous to criticize the status quo directly. This was certainly the case for Thomas More, and certainly the case for Shakespeare. Again, I think it's worth asking students whether it is dangerous to criticize the status quo today. But that's another issue. Let's say something about the 19th century before we come to the two texts I want to look at more carefully. In the 19th century, we have a rapidly growing world population. And at the same time, the advent of rapid communication the advent of rapid communication brings different cultures into competition for limited resources. And this creates, probably for the first time, the sense that the world needs to be managed globally. The more that science and technology develop, the more utopias and dystopias are imagined, because hyper-organized worlds begin to seem more and more possible. So dystopias have always gone hand in hand with a certain element of science fiction that is projecting into the future an even greater capacity to organize the world than the one we have today. In fact, worth remembering that Orwell's 1984 actually opens with this quotation from the Russian writer Nicholas Berdyaev. He says, utopias seem much more feasible than one thought in the past. And actually, he goes on to say that the time will come when intellectuals will have to work to stop the realization of utopias, because he sees every utopia as potentially a dystopia. Going to mention two texts from the 19th century, both utopias. Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, an American writer, describes a bureaucratized utopia where all industry has been nationalized and where the omnipresent machine has drastically reduced the amount of labor. Now, he thought that that was a utopia. However, William Morris in England immediately thought of Bellamy's book as a dystopia. And he wrote a book called News from Nowhere, which is a sort of pastoral utopia as an answer to his technical utopia. Again, it's a socialist book, but in a state without machines and without central state control. Morris wrote, Bellamy's only idea for making labor tolerable is to decrease the amount of it by means of fresh developments of machinery. Morris, on the other hand, thought that labor should actually be attractive in itself. Obviously, William Morris was associated with crafts and art and so on and so forth. So for Morris, Bellamy's utopia was a dystopia. I think that's a point worth remembering, that people may disagree about how attractive or not a society is. A second summary, and we'll get to our text. Utopias and dystopias actually question the desirability of social organization, social control, and above all, the instruments of control, machines and later computers. But at the same time, and you can see there's a contradiction here, at the same time, there is a consensus that large populations and finite resources demand new forms of control. So it's worth remembering that the world population in 1800 was around 1 billion, and now it is close to 8 billion. Most of that has been added in the 20th century. So you can see that there is a certain understandable anxiety in relation to that. And the debate obviously becomes more intense today with the creation of artificial intelligence, awareness of the climate crisis. So it seems the world needs to be governed in some respects as a whole, but under whose control? Now, this question of who was going to control the whole world first became a major concern in the 1920s and 30s, which brings us to the two key texts, I think, of the 20th century. Obviously, we're talking about British literature. Otherwise we could mention Yevgeny Zamyatin's book, We, or many other texts, but we're going to stay with British and American literature. The two key texts of the 20th century, Brave New World, 1932, Aldous Huxley, and then 1984, George Orwell. These are the original first editions. The texts present antithetical views, which is why it's really a lot of fun to invite students to think about these books together in relation to each other. In 1984, as I think we all know 1984 probably better than Brave New World. In 1984, people are controlled by inflicting pain. But in Brave New World, people are controlled by inflicting, if we can use that word, pleasure. We have this interesting reflection by a guy called Neil Postman, who wrote a book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, in 1985. Orwell feared those who would ban books. Huxley feared there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. So we already have a very interesting contrast here. Let's have a look at the world of Brave New World. Again, it was written in reply to another book, a book called Men Like Gods, published by H.G. Wells in 1923. Obviously, H.G. Wells was the man who wrote The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine and many other wonderful books. So again, the dystopia is part of a debate. Now, Wells had described a utopia where people would live peacefully without religion, without politics, without state control, communicating by telepathy. That was how he looked towards the future, and benefiting from all kinds of advanced science. One of the characters says, our education is our government, with the idea that if you're taught well, and teachers obviously should be alert to this, if you're taught well, you will behave well. We can obviously discuss that at some length. Science would solve the problems of poverty, crime, violence, and unhappiness of every kind. Now, Aldous Huxley's approach was not to show that this was impossible, but to imagine what it would really mean if you actually did it. Let's remember that the the book was published then in 34, so he was writing it and thinking about it in the late 1920s and early 30s. These years were characterized by the breakdown of macroeconomic systems. In particular, we all remember the Great Depression, 1926. Huxley had two major anxieties. First, that Europe would come to resemble the USA, that it would be obsessed with machine manufacture and consumerism. And second, that democratic government was incapable of meeting modern economic challenges. Parliaments, he thought at one point, should be replaced by men who will compel us to do and suffer what a rational foresight demands. So it's quite a frightening anti-democratic position that Huxley took. But as we know, it was a very common position in the 1920s. Obviously, that position became a little less common and popular after the experiences of Nazism, fascism, and communism. So the date of Huxley's narrative is 2540 of the Christian era, or AF 632, where AF stands for after Ford. The invention of the production line in the USA is considered the founding moment of a new civilization, now known as the world state. The world is now being run as one single state. And indeed, the novel opens with the description of a production line. But the production line is not manufacturing consumer goods. It is a production line manufacturing human beings, different models of human beings. So the individual is not going to be controlled after the event of his or her birth. He's going to be a planned product in a totally controlled environment. And everything in the book follows from this central idea that human beings are no longer individuals, but planned products. Here we can see an image from one of the many movies about the book, where we see the babies being produced in their bottle-like wombs. All dystopias like to introduce new terminology to create a kind of situation where we imagine we're in a different world. Huxley invents the Bokanovskified egg, which is a human female egg capable of producing almost 100 identical twins. And he has the director of the reproduction unit describing the Bokanovskified egg. Standard men and women in uniform batches, the whole of a small factory staffed with the products of a single Bokanovskified egg. 96 identical twins working 96 identical machines. The voice was almost tremulous with enthusiasm. You really know where you are for the first time in history. And he quoted the planetary motto, community, identity, stability. So you can imagine 96 identical people working the machines in a factory. It's satirical, it's light, and at the same time quite frightening. Let's just notice that the planetary motto, community, identity, stability, looks very much like the kind of motto we might see around today, produced by one of the many global organizations that run our lives. So in Aldous Huxley's world, reproduction is no longer carried out in relations between men and women, but separately. So relationships and reproduction become an important aspect of the book. And indeed, always relationships and reproduction are an important issue in dystopias. Sex has been split off from human reproduction. Most women are designed to be infertile. Sex is actually encouraged, an unusual state of affairs, encouraged by the state. Sex is encouraged from childhood as a pleasure to be enjoyed whenever, with whoever, Romance and fidelity are discouraged, and the idea of marriage is forgotten. Obviously, romance is discouraged because romance can lead to pain, and pain can lead to instability. So the idea is that everybody has to keep having sex as frequently as possible with as many different people as possible, a very unusual state of affairs. Huxley had seen something that he thought was getting to be like this in California on his trip there. Conditioning, brainwashing. Here's the director of the reproductive unit again. We also predestine and condition. We decant our babies, very curious word to use. We decant our babies as socialized human beings, as alphas or epsilons. These are names of different models of human being. Alphas or epsilons as future sewage workers or future, he was going to say, future world controllers. That is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their inescapable social destiny. But this is an interesting subject, obviously, that can be discussed at length. Let's just mention the different classes of people, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon. These people are being conditioned all the time in their sleep as children. They listen to long recorded voices, brainwashed as they sleep with different behavioral suggestions for different models of human being. Let me just read you one of the suggestions. Alpha children wear grey. They work much harder than we do because they're so frightfully clever. I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta because I don't work so hard. And then we are much better than the gammas and deltas. Gammas are stupid. They all wear green, and delta children wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with delta children. And epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid, and so on and so forth. Huxley was obviously having a lot of fun at the expense of the British class system. But the idea that children are directed towards different destinies is already clear. For example, in school systems that have different names for schools with different destinies assigned to children, and so on and so forth. So again, this is a fertile area of discussion, I think. When Aldous Huxley wrote the introduction to the 1943 edition, he went back to this whole question of suggestions. We remember that in the book, again, one of the directors of the society says, the child mind is these suggestions, and the sum of these suggestions is the child mind, but all these suggestions are our suggestions. An interesting question today, how many suggestions we receive daily from the internet and so on and so forth. Aldous Huxley, sorry, it was in his 1946 introduction, said a really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which a population of slaves do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. To make them love it is the task assigned to ministries of propaganda, newspaper editors, and, yes, you got it, school teachers. So school teachers basically there to encourage children to love their servitude, an area for discussion. Let's mention a product called soma. Soma obviously taken from the Greek word, which means body, but also from the Sanskrit word, where it means a kind of elixir, a sort of special distillation, which the gods would drink at sacrifices. Soma is a sort of drug that everybody can take to feel happy. So when somebody is unhappy, they take soma. They have free pills of soma distributed to them. And so the whole question of happiness and sadness is medicalized. It's not given any dignity, I'm unhappy because of this. It's simply a question of reorganizing the chemicals in my body. And we have these kind of slogans used all the time. What you need is a gram of soma. All the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects. Huxley is very provocative, aligning Christianity with alcohol as two ways of feeling happier. Take a holiday from reality whenever you like and come back without so much as a headache. Now, meantime, and this is a very curious idea that Huxley adds, the physiological stigmata of old age have been abolished. People don't grow physically old. They just live to a certain point and then they die. So characters remain constant throughout a lifetime. They don't change their opinions. They don't, nothing is unstable. For entertainment in this world, people go to the feelies, movies where physical feelings are directly transmitted to their body. So all intense living is vicarious. Books are banned because they encourage introspection and individuality, which leads to instability. So again, Huxley's provocative by suggesting that books provoke instability or perhaps progress, but one or the other, they are unwelcome. The past was barbarous and unstable. What with mothers and lovers, it's a quotation, uncertainties and poverty, people were forced to feel strongly. And feeling strongly, how could they be stable? Indeed. Fortunate boys, said the controller, no pains have been spared to preserve you from having emotions at all. Again, Huxley's wonderfully witty. No pains have been spared. Pain is exactly what has been eliminated from the society. Stability was practically assured. Okay, so the role of pain is absolutely crucial to understanding Huxley's vision. The book suggests that the human qualities we admire really can't be developed without individual pain and without social instability. So a world where there's no pain is a world where there are no qualities and no responsibilities, just work and entertainment. Everybody's happy now. This expression occurs time and again in the book. They had heard the words repeated 150 times every day, every night for 12 years. One thing that's interesting from a literary point of view is how difficult it is for Huxley to write a plot for a world which is entirely stable. He has to imagine a person who has not been properly conditioned, where something went wrong on the production line. So Bernard Marx is small, ugly, grumpy, sexually frustrated. And this makes him critical of the system. I'd rather be myself, he says, myself and nasty, not somebody else, however jolly. So Huxley's interesting. He doesn't imagine a really noble person who's opposing the system. The person who's only opposing the system because he hasn't been made properly, and so he's sexually frustrated. There is another person opposing the system, and he's a writer. He's called Helmholtz Watson, a very strange name. He's a man employed to write infantile slogans, but even writing infantile slogans encourages him to think that maybe he could write something more serious, something more intense, more violent. You've got to be hurt and upset, he reflects. Otherwise, you can't think of the really good penetrating X-ray phrases. So again, achievement in writing is related to pain and instability. What the two men shared, so Marx and Watson, was the knowledge that they were individuals. There is one other character in the book, as another major character. John was born in a reserve for savages in New Mexico. So the state has certain areas which they have left uncivilized so that they can observe human nature in its primitive form. And John has learnt to read from a copy of Shakespeare's plays, which he has found. Now, obviously, there's absolutely nothing probable about this, but it's an interesting idea. We have a so-called savage figure who nevertheless knows Shakespeare's plays off by heart. Brought to the world state, he finds it empty and valueless and wants to go back to a primitive world. He says, I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. In fact, said Mustafa Mond, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. And paradoxically, the reader of Brave New World is invited to prefer unhappiness to happiness. So let's turn now to 1984 with after this extravagant provocation from Huxley. We turn to 1984, which is probably the most famous of all dystopias, and immediately the tone of the two books is totally different. Huxley's book is light and provocative and satirical, even though what it's discussing is immensely serious. Orwell's book is grim and dramatic from the beginning. Obviously, he was writing in the wake of Nazism and fascism. He was writing at a time when Stalinism was at its height. He imagines in a much more simple way, I think, than Huxley. He simply imagines an extension of 1930s and 40s totalitarianism. The book is focused on a single individual. I mean, it works much better, I think, as a novel than Brave New World. It's a much more immediately dramatic novel. The book is focused on one individual, Winston Smith, and the description of the system is focused on the total control of information and the state's obsession with orthodoxy. So hence the key technical novelty of 1984 is the telescreen, which provides constant propaganda in every room, in every part of the state, and at the same time spies on individuals 24 hours a day. Something that would be quite unnecessary in Brave New World because people have all been already indoctrinated. So here's a shot from one of the many movies of 1984. We can see the telescreen and the famous slogans, which we'll look at in a minute. Big Brother is watching you. Obviously, Big Brother is a very old expression in English, which you say, if you treat me like that, I'll get my big brother to talk to you, sort of thing. Here, Big Brother becomes the sort of Stalin figure of the book. On coins, on stamps, on the cover of books, on banners, on posters, and on the wrappings of a cigarette package, everywhere. Always the eyes watching you and the voice enveloping you, asleep or awake, working or eating, indoors or out of doors, in the bath or in bed, no escape. Nothing was your own except the few cubic centimeters inside your skull. So this is the world Orwell imagines. Obviously, in Brave New World, you don't even really have the cubic centimeters inside your skull because they were mass produced before you were born. So this is a world that I think is much more recognizable, that the sense that the individual is against the state. Orwell concentrates a lot on language, neologisms, and slogans. The state is producing a new language, newspeak, which is simply going to reduce the vocabulary drastically so that people can't think. We are destroying words, scores of them, hundreds of them, every day. Again, an interesting subject to ask students how far their ability to have ideas about social organization or about anything, how far that ability depends on knowing the language and knowing it well. These are some of the words that the book famously introduced: doublethink, thought police, hate week, reality control, base crime, and then the three famous propaganda slogans: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. You can see that these slogans are deliberately designed to create a sort of maximum confusion that makes it difficult to think clearly if we start equating opposites in this way. Certainly any of these ideas, doublethink, the idea that one can believe one thing while knowing it's not true, the idea that there are police actually checking what we're thinking, You know, it sometimes seems that way when we're dealing with the computer these days. Hate week, the idea of getting people together to hate an enemy. It's not difficult to imagine things like this in our own world. Face crime, when you don't respond in quite the right way to some news. Reality control. They're also interesting in the book that every product is called victory. Victory cigarettes, victory gym, victory mansions, etc. So the citizen is constantly invited to think of himself as part of a society which is embattled, which is in a battle against something else. Certainly, you know, it's interesting in our own world how frequently events are framed in a narrative of battle. I mean, we remember with the COVID events that we were invited to think of ourselves as in a battle, and so on and so forth. So the idea of vaporized and the idea of the destruction of the past. People simply disappeared. That is, people who failed to show that they were orthodox simply disappeared. Always during the night, your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you'd ever done was wiped out. You were abolished, annihilated, vaporized was the usual word. Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. So this control of the past, that when somebody is destroyed, they are simply not only destroyed in the present, but their whole life is simply annihilated, is an important idea. And again, as we mentioned earlier, it's the idea that you can stop time in the present moment, because once you've destroyed the past, it's difficult to move towards it. It's difficult to learn from the past to move towards a different future. He was alone. The past was dead. The future was unimaginable. But one character does imagine the future. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. These are very strong dramatic ideas which made the book so hugely successful. Let's just say quickly about the plot. The plot is much easier to imagine in Orwell's state because there's an obvious tension between individual and authority. So when Winston opens a diary to record the truth, and when he's approached by a girl who's in love with him, the direction of the plot is inevitable. Is this famous moment, quoting here, the thing that he was about to do was to open a diary. If detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death, or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Of course, the reader knows immediately that the diary will be detected. And the reader knows immediately that the two lovers will be captured. So the book has this terrible feeling from the beginning that its protagonist is doomed. A few words about, I used to teach 1984 and Brave New World myself at the university. I think one way to approach these books that's really useful is to ask students to compare certain themes in the book, and then to compare them with what it's like in our world today. Both of the books have very curious positions on family relationships and sex. In Brave New World, marriage, families, and parenthood have all been eliminated, but promiscuous sex is encouraged. In 1984, marriage and parenthood are encouraged because children are required, but everything's done to remove the excitement of sex. Sex has become a duty. In fact, Orwell actually says you had to think of sex as a kind of enema, not very attractive. There is even an anti-sex league. So it's an interesting discussion of the way societies have often had tendencies towards a sort of rigid puritanism or promiscuity, and the way that affects social control. News and information is another interesting issue. In Brave New World, the news is trivial and information is technical and neutral. The planet lives in peace. No great changes are expected. People are not encouraged to think. In 1984, news is relentless and dramatic. They had one news program after another, referring either to the constant wars or the state's supposed achievements or the conspiracies of its evil enemies. And people are kept in a frenzy of urgency. It's an interesting question how far creating a constant sense of crisis can become a form of social control. I just want to mention just one more thing, really. Writing books and art. Dystopias, modern dystopias, always try to present writing as a key form of resistance to society. So in Brave New World, this is obviously a little bit self-serving from the part of the authors, as if saying, you know, I'm the person who you need to look to defend yourself from this kind of society. In Brave New World, Hemholtz Watson's desire to move from writing trivial propaganda to serious literature is subversive, but it's not really dangerous, because in this pain-free society, nobody is interested in reading about difficult experience. So in Aldous Huxley's world, the writer is subversive, but he doesn't really present a problem. In 1984, Winston's decision to keep a diary and record facts and personal thoughts is considered a serious threat to the state, for which he will be seriously punished. Both of these books actually flatter the reader by suggesting that reading and writing are revolutionary activities and that the reader is superior to the kind of society that's being projected. Here are some other possible themes: war and peace, social hierarchy. Like, when I say war and peace, I mean war and peace, the way they are constructed in these societies, and the way we witness them in our own society today. Social hierarchies, both of these societies are organized very rigidly in social terms, with ruling class people and working people. There's always a figure who sympathizes with the protagonist, but is nevertheless part of the establishment. That's a classic figure in dystopias, in other dystopias as well. Somebody who understands that the dystopia is not a perfect world, but nevertheless continues to serve it. Those are figures who are present in many other narratives from the past as well. We could go back to things like the Inquisition and so on and so forth. Conspiracy theories, machine production, and technology. I'm aware that my time is running out here. So it's worth asking, which vision is closer to our society? Which of these two visions? Which is closer to the reality as we know it, or we think we know it, in other countries like the USA, Russia, and China? Does the state seek to control us by censorship and repression, or by allowing us to be overwhelmed by trivia, or neither, or both? Does censorship and repression exist today, but exercised by means not controlled by the state, for example, by social media? And we can also ask the question of other dystopias written more recently. So I'm just going to mention two. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, 1985. So Atwood's book gives us a vision of a repressive religious regime in the USA. It's a regime at war with its neighbors. And the whole atmosphere has a lot in common with 1984. So somebody's under constant surveillance, constantly having to hide their thoughts. And the power of the state depends on fierce repression and demands obedience. What is different is the focus on the subordinate condition of women who are forced to have babies to supply citizens for the state. And again, sex is repressed and everything is done to diminish sexual pleasure. Very different dystopia in Kazuo Ishiguro's book, Never Let Me Go. Here you have a community of clones, and these clones are actually being bred to provide replacement organs for ordinary human beings. The whole thing has certain elements of Brave New World, as if we were looking at the experience of those who pay the price for the carefully engineered happiness of the majority. So I think one of the interesting things about Brave New World in 1984 is that they seem to provide like two templates that other writers have looked at and developed in all kinds of ways. I think one question to ask about contemporary dystopias is whether they're written really in order to imagine and warn us about a really possible developments, or whether they actually just using the dystopian form for the possibility of drama and pathos that it offers, which of course is completely acceptable. Like, I do think that Brave New World in 1984 are two books that were so passionately concerned that this was the direction the world was going, that maybe this is why they have had such enormous influence where other books haven't. So at the end, and you will all be getting a copy of this PowerPoint, I put in, I'm not going to read because my time's pretty much run out. I put in a very small bibliography with just a few key books, some technocratic utopias, some pastoral utopias, some science fiction utopias. Ursula Le Guin is a fascinating book, particularly, and some of the most famous dystopias. Okay, so that's me. My time is up. I'm going to pass you back to Valentina, who's going to say a word about some other things.
Thank you, Tim. I hope you all enjoyed the lesson. I can tell you that there was one time in the chat that people asked me to silence the comment because they wanted to listen to you without interruption and comments. So that's how much your lesson and your words were admired. So I wanted to tell you something about the fact that if you like this kind of approach to literature, in the new version, the new edition of Performer Heritage, the book by Marina Spiazzi, Marina Tavella, and Margaret Layton, Tim Parks have a recurrent section called Tim's Take, and it is created with short videos, 3-4 minutes, on important topics in English literature. And of course, you can watch a video with Tim speaking a shorter version of what we did today with the exercise and question. And so you can bring Tim Parks into the classrooms with you from tomorrow, actually. So you can find them in Performer Heritage. And if you go on the next slide, Tim, please. You will see, you also have a whole set, did you like it? You also have a whole set of videos on Collezione, which is our website where we collect all the videos. So from the medieval times, from the Middle Ages to early modern age, you have all the videos. And now I think it's time for many questions. So the first question I will ask is there are two questions linked to the reactions of teenagers. So the first one is, why do you think teenagers are so involved and like so much these topic themes?
Oh, I've taken off the condivisione so that at least I can see your face a little bit better. I have the impression that I'm talking to someone. Let me just say that I was talking recently to the person in London who edits my books, and she told me that more than 50% of the manuscripts and typescripts that they receive from people who want to be authors were in fact dystopic novels, particularly coming from young people. My own impression is that people who do read, and alas, there are not that many of them. There are not that many of them left, perhaps, but people who read a lot of novels, particularly between the ages of, say, 16 and 30, are reading novels in a different way. A very young person is reading a novel for entertainment and adventure. And I think the older person already knows what their position is. But the young adult is reading the novel to learn about the life which is opening up excitingly around him. And the dystopic novel is clearly a novel that electrifies the young person to the possibility of how badly society could go wrong. So I think it's something that young people are inevitably fascinated by, perhaps more than readers my age.
I have another question. Claudia, which was one of our guests, she's writing that both 1984 and Brave New World, they are novels that leave a very deep sense of desperate powerlessness. So as a teacher, how can she pass this idea, of course, but also the idea that students are the future, and how can she compensate with something positive, not with dystopia? I mean, obviously.
Well, who am I to provide the perfect answer to this question? But this is an excellent question, because indeed both of these books do raise the question of the passivity or otherwise of the individual. Orwell's book is really a very frightening book, and I suppose the only answer is that these books are there precisely to say that we are not going to accept this kind of future. Both of these books are clearly an invitation not to go in the direction that they prophesy. Like, both of these writers would be very happy to be proved wrong about the future. But I do think the whole question of how far we're invited to be passive in the modern world is a very big issue, and it's an issue that these books deliberately raise. So, all I can say is that one's own engagement with the students is itself, like one's own determination to resist this kind of thing, is itself a communication that it's possible to act. My answers are always too long.
No, it is not. Lorenzo is asking something quite peculiar. So he's pointing out that dystopia somehow fits British culture or British cultural tradition. We have many examples of British or American dystopian novels. Do you think it is true? Do we have any other examples? Do you see there is a point there, or it's somehow the fact that author read author and then produces something in their tradition?
Well, there are really plenty of dystopian novels from other countries. I mean, by all means, go on the internet and just ask the question. You'll find, Yevgeny Zamyatin's famous novel "We," published in 1924, is one of the absolutely central dystopic texts. Thomas More's "Utopia" was one of the most discussed books in Italy in the century following. Obviously, that's a utopia. The British have often been accused of imagining that they had created an ideal society. Certainly, there are times when Britain was far too pleased with what it had created. So, on the other hand, the British public school has often been used as an example of a possibly dystopic environment. So, it's a question that surprises me, I must say, but I think in general, if we say that the ability to organize society around machines certainly sparks off the possibility of organizing a nightmare society, we can say that with the Industrial Revolution in the UK, Britain becomes definitely one of the first countries, one of the first societies to start thinking in terms of the horrors of a machine-driven society, so that something like Dickens's Hard Times, which again is in your anthology, perhaps I should have mentioned it, is a sort of nightmare vision of a technical world. So it may be because technical advances for a certain period were coming very much out of the Anglo-Saxon world.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another question from Stefano. Would you say that 1984 and Brave New World are prophetic novels?
Well, these were both men who were very in tune with their times, and both of them tried to take elements of their contemporary world and project them into the future. So, Aldous Huxley's Feelies and the sexual promiscuity was clearly borrowed from California, and he said so. Orwell's Telescreen is certainly completely feasible today. So, but on the other hand, not particularly difficult, perhaps at the time to project. On the other hand, there are an awful lot of things today that they didn't foresee. They certainly didn't foresee the telefonino. They didn't foresee that, in an epidemic, we would need an app to go into the post office and we would have to show that we were vaccinated and so on. They didn't, there were all kinds of things that they don't foresee. So, I think all of us can have a go at forecasting the future. I do actually feel that Brave New World is a very frightening vision and in many ways true. But one of the interesting things today is that the kind of censorship we feel when we write, because I feel a certain pressure that there are certain things that I can't say, doesn't come from the state. It comes from society itself, which is interesting.
This is interesting because one of the other questions was also asked by Paula, and she wanted to know if today is one of the possible themes for dystopia is the social media or social media controls by other people. And so I think you asked. I have
well, let me just say that.
Okay.
I think if I was writing a dystopia, it's not my genre, but if I was writing it would be this whole question of social control through ways that are very difficult to combat, if you like, because you don't have an enemy in the state who you can look at and oppose. Yeah, I think it's and obviously for adolescents, I remember particularly one of my children being very upset by stuff that was going around on chat lines and so on and so forth, and that was quite a long time ago. Today.
So back to the comparison between 1984 and Brave New World. What about the conclusions of the novel? Raffaella asks. I mean, John's suicide and Winston's acceptance of Big Brother. So they are in a way spiritually dead. Do you find them similar or opposite as the conclusions?
Well, obviously, when you're writing a dystopia, you don't want to have a happy ending. It's not that kind of book. I mean, unless we imagine the dystopia unraveling and everybody freeing themselves, which is clearly not on the agenda. The idea of the dystopia is to provoke people into resisting that kind of development. So in 1984, Orwell wants to show you that it's really, truly shocking that the individual can be crushed. And when I reread the book before this seminar, and I was thinking, boy, this is really, really difficult to read. I mean, I'd forgotten how intense and horrible the last part of the book is. So it's extremely pessimistic. Brave New World is different. I mean, John would really like to return to a world which is one that we recognize a bit more of feelings and emotions and so on and so forth, but he's unable to do so in a world where he's just become somebody who everybody else is observing because he's unusual, and he kills himself. It's very difficult to know what to think about this, but it's again pessimistic, but it's not the same kind of horror and torture that we find in 1984.
Okay, and as a final question, would you include Lord of the Flies in the dystopian genre?
Well, you know, sometimes I'd see that the Lord of the Flies is included in a dystopian genre. And we remember that Lord of the Flies was actually written as a response to an earlier book for children, which is very popular and also a very good book. The name escapes me now. Perhaps somebody out there can remember. So it does have that sense of being involved in a debate about what happens to a group of people if they are forced to organize themselves in a little society. But I think what's different about it is that usually we think of a modern dystopia as projecting a sort of world society or a world organization, and clearly Lord of the Flies doesn't do that.
So thank you very much. I think people are suggesting that maybe the book you were thinking of is Coral Island.
Coral Island,
Okay,
yeah,
so
which I read as a child and very much loved. It's about a group of school children who get shipwrecked on an island, as in Lord of the Flies, and they behave wonderfully and they organize themselves in best possible fashion. And of course, Golding responded to that with this terribly negative thing. But actually, if you read the two books, quite frankly, I think it's a pretty open discussion about which book is like, oh, okay, the other book is much more of a sort of child's fantasy, but I'm not sure that things would end up quite so badly as Golding would have us imagine.
okay, so as you can probably see, people are thanking you for the wonderful lesson, and I thank you as well, because it's been 1 hour of pure pleasure. So thank you very much.
Let's not overdo it. Thank you, Valentin. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.